Thank you so much for joining us for today's workshop on prevention programming and survivor support for LGBTQ plus men and boys of faith. I am Alana Bloom, the Senior Director of Community Response at Jewish Women International. I am pleased to introduce our two presenters, Ayana Wallace-View and Ariella Neckeritz. Ayana is the Training and Technical Assistance Manager with UGMA Inc., the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community, a nationally designated culturally specific resource center focused on Black women and girls in the Black community. Ariella is the Director of Youth Programs at the Representation Project, which aims to fight sexism and harmful stereotypes through films, education, research, and social activism. So excited to have both Ayana and Ariella with us today. I'll now turn it over to Ayana.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. We're really excited for this conversation, and we will go ahead and jump in. So, Ariella, you can advance to the next slide. So for today, we just wanted to get started. We're going to be using the chat. Hopefully, folks will be super engaged, chat and Q&A. But let's get started with introducing yourselves in the chat, names, your pronouns that you like to use, and then our opening question: why is it important to talk about identity and experience with the communities that you serve when working with men and boys of faith, and especially when addressing gender-based violence within faith communities? So take a couple seconds, get your names and pronouns in, and then let's think about this opening question. Like, why is it important to talk about identity? Why is it important to talk about experience with the communities we're working with, and then also with the advocates we're working with too? And consortium members, I know you're here in the background. Feel free to also answer these questions and to fully participate in our workshop for today as well. So, why is it important? Let's get to that. What are some thoughts? Okay, I see a comment. Because everyone needs to be recognized. Absolutely. Reminding people of how identity relates to what people take out of religion and how social norms are reinforced religiously to reproduce violence in institutions. Yes, we'll get to that. What else? To reduce stigma, shame, and guilt. Absolutely. Our identities can define our experiences. Yes. It's important to validate a person's identity and experience as a way to empower them. Absolutely. Learning breaks the cycle. I love that, Trina. It affects how accessible resources and services are to people. Absolutely, Chelsea, right? And so if we just take that as the general framework of we're learning and sharing and growing together, that's at the root of why we need to have these conversations. So I see some other comments coming through: to promote dialogue and empowerment for all, breaking cycles and empowering folks' experiences. Yes. Next slide. And so our learning objectives, we're really going to look at some of these different dynamics that have been talked about already in the chat. So defining and exploring intersectionality as within the context of faith and identity, defining key LGBTQ plus terms and concepts. We're going to be looking at and analyzing power and privilege and really examining how power and control dynamics within LGBTQ plus relationships and dating relationships come up. We're going to be looking at sharing together, because again, this is a learning collaborative space, but really sharing best practices with each other, about how you develop prevention programming, developing campaigns, and being responsive to faith and LGBTQ plus communities. We're going to look at and understand the concept of coming out and also some of the challenges with that, but with experience in general, what barriers exist for people. And then we're going to look at some of the resources and, again, best practices for supporting survivors. Next slide. So real quick, I'm not going to go too much into my whole life story. But again, my name is Ayana Wallace-View. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the TTA manager with Ujima Inc. My background is in women's and gender studies. It's been rooted in me super strong since undergrad. In grad school, my area of research and focus was in violence in communities of color, specifically intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, reproductive and sexual coercion, and just really with the framework of structural violence as a whole and how that impacts all of our communities. My career began as a case manager in domestic violence shelter. So I met amazing survivors. I met amazing community folks, really great responders and service providers, and also saw some really glaring systems responses. And so after time in shelter, I went over and I worked at the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, which is the Maryland DV Coalition. I initially joined the lethality assessment team. So I was traveling nationally, working with service providers and law enforcement to implement the protocol. And after some time on that team, transferred to the actual Maryland training team, where I was the lead trainer for the state for several years before coming to Ujima, where I've been since 2019 and love because we get to have some really dedicated conversations to these topics and to our communities as well. So I'm going to pass it over to my amazing co-presenter and let them introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Ariella Nekritz. My pronouns are they, them, and she, her. I'm the Director of Youth Programs for the Representation Project, which, as Alana mentions, we aim to fight sexism and harmful stereotypes through film, education, action, and research. You may know us. We've created a number of documentary films like The Mask You Live In, Misrepresentation, The Great American Lie, and currently streaming on Hulu. Fair Play, which looks at equal distribution of labor in the home and creating equity in the home. At the Representation Project, I oversee our gender equity training program, which brings together sexual and dating violence prevention alongside social emotional learning, leadership development, mental health intervention, and media literacy. Prior to coming to the Representation Project, I worked at Jewish Women International for 6.5 years as the Director of Violence Prevention and Training. So I had the amazing opportunity to lead training, write curriculum, working with college campuses, Jewish community centers, sexual and domestic violence service providers, and youth groups. And in college, I came to this work as a survivor activist. So I'm showing up today as a non-binary queer person who is also bisexual. And I'm really grateful that we have this space to think about the intersection of faith identities and LGBTQ and supporting specifically men and boys. Turning it back over to Ayana.
Thank you. Thank you. And so we had a lot of fun framing out this workshop, but it's always really important for us to set sort of the tone for how we're going to operate and be together in space. So we have a couple workshop agreements. Feel free to add in the chat if you want to expand on any of these or ask a question about any of them. But really quickly, just to go over these few, not the main one. The first one is active listening. It's really easy to get distracted when we're on virtual webinars or webinars in general. I know you're still getting emails coming in. You're probably getting phone calls and having to deal with stuff. Handle whatever you need to, but re-engage the conversation. Be present, silence that internal chatter. So my mom growing up would always say to me, I know you hear me, but are you listening? It partially was probably because I was raised by two lawyers. And so I knew if I had a rebuttal, I had to get it in quickly. However, it's always a really good practice moment, reflection moment, right? To just pause and let things settle in, and tune out all the extra stuff as much as you can and really focus on what somebody's saying to you in the moment. Be open. We're all coming to this workshop in this space with different backgrounds, different lived experiences, different perspectives. And so let's be open to what's being shared in the room. Push through your growing edge. For some of this is very 101 and we know it. For others, this is completely new information. And so wherever you are, let's make sure we're just pushing through and continuing to learn and grow together. Respectfully challenge each other. Not everyone has to agree. Again, we're coming from different backgrounds and different lenses, But if we are disagreeing, let's make sure we're doing it as respectfully as possible, so that it's still a learning collaborative. Lean in and lean out. So really, everyone just lean in. Really lean into this conversation, lean into the chat, right? Lean into the resources that are being shared, the videos that are going to show on the screen. Really just making this a cohesive community as we, again, learn and grow together. And then the most important from this list actually is to continue to have these conversations, because there's no point in us sitting together for the next hour and a half if the conversation's going to end here. We really want to make sure this is transformative work and really make sure this is meaningful work as well. Next slide. So we're going to start out with framing intersectionality, especially as it relates to faith and LGBTQ identities. But intersectionality is one of my favorite, absolutely favorite things to talk about. So let's go ahead and jump in, Ariella. So Kimberly Crenshaw, if you don't know her, she's an amazing person to get to know their work and their theories. She says, if you don't have a lens that's been trained to look at how various forms of discrimination come together, you're unlikely to develop a set of policies that will be as inclusive as they need to be. And so when I think about intersectionality, a lot of folks are very hesitant to talk about difference. They're very hesitant to talk about, the fact that their perspective or the way they grew up could be completely different from somebody else's. And difference and growing up differently, different cultures, different ethnicities, different faith practices, that's a beautiful thing. It makes the world glow brighter, and it still can be very hard to talk through. But the reality is, if we aren't able to talk about difference, if we aren't able to talk about different layers of experience or even trauma, we are, as advocates, as service providers, not fully doing the job we could do. And we're not actually going to be able to respond to survivors in the most meaningful way because our perspective has been limited. So let's get into intersectionality. And Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, that's what I'm looking for, coined the term intersectionality. And the way I think about it, the simplest way I think about it is, what are the relationships between identities and systems? And so for her, it was a framework really designed to explore the dynamics between identities like race, class, and gender and sexuality, for instance, with what she called connected systems of oppression, or connected systems that can be oppressive. So what's the relationship between race, class, gender, sexuality with patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism, for instance? There are a lot of different layers to unpack, and it's really hard to just do it in one setting. So let's take it piece by piece. And again, continue to have these conversations, because you can build out such a greater understanding of people's experience and of their lives. So let's start with this. If we were to draw out, design, name the most normalized person in our society, generally in American society, what would that person look like? What identities would they hold? How would they show up in the world? What perceptions even would be about them? Let's go ahead and drop those in the chat. So the most normalized person in our society, who we're told is the most normalized, how do they show up in the world? All right, I see white, cisgender, straight, male. What else? Upper middle class. What else? Wealthy. Mm-hmm. Able-bodied. A husband or a father. Christian. Middle-aged. Mm-hmm. What else? I'll add in neurotypical or perceived to be neurotypical, US citizen, English speaking, and generally without an accent, because we know certain accents in the US are more esteemed than others, right? Mm-hmm. Owns their own home, steady income or job. Yes, US citizen. What else? College graduate. Absolutely, Ashley. Thin. Yep. What else? Say generally, never been addicted to drugs, never been incarcerated, never been homeless, didn't grow up in the child welfare system, right? And we can keep naming all these different access to healthcare. That's a huge one. So they have health insurance or can afford health insurance. And so as we continue to name these different layers of experience or different layers of identity, we also have to really put into perspective, a lot of us are never going to fit this category, right? We might have a couple of these different pieces and identities, and still we know who's considered the norm and who's not. So when we think about that, if your identity is considered the norm, what then happens to your experience? If you're considered the norm, what happens to you as you move throughout the world? You have privilege. You're centered. Your experience is at the center of how things are done. And so if we know, a white male who's cisgendered, who's heterosexual, who's middle class, English speaking, American, college educated, owns their own home, owns a car, has insurance. If we know all of those things, that person is the norm. How do we know that? Through what? How are those norms maintained? Through the oppression of others. What else? Through power and control, absolutely. In ads, policies, social media, sitcoms, systematic inequities. And I love this graphic specifically because that second green ring or that second ring from the middle, that's what keeps us in line with knowing who's the norm and who's not, right? Like all those isms we always talk about. Sexism, ageism, transphobia, classism, ethnocentrism, racism, ableism. They keep us in line with knowing who's the norm and who's not, because when you are the norm, your experience is centered. You don't have to think about, if I get pulled over for this reason, what happens to me? A lot of folks just have no concept of different people's experiences because you haven't had to. And so it's really important to think about, okay, I have multiple identities. Where then may I have power or not within different systems? Because we all have different layers of power and privilege as we navigate systems. And so if someone is not the norm, how then might they interact with different systems? Let's start with the legal system. If you are not considered the norm, what happens to you as you engage the legal system? Discrimination, over surveillance to begin with, not being believed, treated as the other, lack of access, right? Hesitation to reach out. And I like those two pieces where we just pulled apart right there, being belittled, conscious or unconscious or subconscious bias towards you, right? I love where we're going with this because when we think about LGBTQ men as they navigate the criminal legal system, what's happening then? What happens? Because we see it where, right, we could say men of color and poor men have been over incarcerated for generations. We know that to be true. We also know it to be true that Black trans folks are being over incarcerated now. What happens then as they navigate these different systems? So potentially being belittled, not having access to hormones, not having access to healthcare where you feel affirmed, sexual violence potentially, lack of social supports. What happens when folks get out of jail, right? Like, how are they re-entering communities? How are they re-entering relationships? There are a lot of different layers to think through. We could talk about the education system. It breaks community trust. Absolutely, Erin. We could talk about the education system. We could talk about, well, really, yeah. Let's talk about that for a second, actually. What happens as LGBTQ men and boys of whatever intersections are navigating an education system? Because we've talked about school to prison pipeline for Black men and boys. We see in the news, we see all through the country, different things happening in school systems with just education, period. Some folks might feel they have to make themselves small or that they don't have power. It's sometimes a lack of safe space, being told to man up, absolutely. Lack of sex education, right? That's a great point. Lack of sex education. It's not mandated throughout the US, right? So learning about bodies, learning about consent, learning about what feels healthy or not, people are missing out on a lot of that. Toxic masculinity and how pervasive it is in our society, absolutely. And so for us as advocates, as service providers, intersectionality is actually one of the most helpful tools to do our jobs because we get at all these different layers. Oh, okay, me understanding that a Black trans man is going to experience the world and experience systems differently. Okay, I need to unpack that so I know how to be a better advocate, right? I need to unpack that so I know, okay, maybe this is why historically, right? Like, even if it's not us today and we haven't had a bad interaction, historically, how have people been treated within systems? Because we might be advocates and have best intentions, but we still represent a system. And so what has the relationship been in community, right? Like, all of that plays a part in how we do our jobs, how we serve folks, how we support survivors. Also, I see another comment by Lillian, no examples of healthy queer relationships. Absolutely, right? And so really being able to unpack these different layers, it's so vital for how we're going to do the work and especially do prevention work. Next slide. And so we wanted to start out, just to preface this first one here. I love their videos and I love the rest we have in this PowerPoint actually, but I love their videos because they do a really great job of just framing out what intersectionality looks like. This first one, Sunny Singh, this video was produced by raceforward.org and it's available on YouTube, as are the rest of these videos as well, if you want to go back and look at them another time too. So we'll watch these through and then we can unpack them a little bit as well.
My name is Sunny Singh. I'm a musician and social justice educator. Race and religion. We all have multiple identities, and those multiple identities are intersecting to affect our experience, to affect the way that we walk through the world. I am a South Asian. I also consider myself Punjabi. I am a Sikh, as in S-I-K-H, the faith. I am a cisgender man. I'm straight and I grew up middle class, and I'm able-bodied. Structural racism, structural religious oppression or Christian hegemony, structural patriarchy or sexism, all of these things are actually interlocked in society. Intersectionality means that we acknowledge that we actually all have to fight against all forms of oppression if we actually truly want to get free. I can't think about my racial identity as a brown person or as a South Asian American without also experiencing sort of the racialized aspects of being a Sikh, right? Being someone who wears a turban, who has a beard, those are very racialized things, even though for me, they have to do with my religion. I haven't been able to walk through this world or to walk through this country as a brown-skinned, turban-wearing, beard-having man without that being just very apparent in the stares that I get, in the derogatory comments, the terrorists, the Osamas, the ISIS. My religion, Sikhism, has sort of been compounded with this vilification of Muslims and Muslim-looking people at large. You know, that might be sort of technically religious oppression, for example, or it might be tied to Islamophobia. But those things are deeply tied to racism and white supremacy more broadly. My race, my gender, my religion might very well have consequences on whether I make it walking down the street alive. That's the reality that we're living in. So to not talk about them, to not confront those things very directly, to me is really the divisive thing, right? That's allowing these divisions and allowing these hierarchies and allowing these injustices to continue perpetuating themselves. If we don't stand up against them, if we don't amplify our voices against these things, they're going to continue on whether we like it or not.
Intersectionality describes how gender, race, ethnicity, and other labels intersect to create unique dynamics, both empowering and/or oppressive. I'm so much more than just a Black gay man. I'm Isaac, I'm adopted, I'm an artist, a geek, a brother, and even a kayaker. These things are all badges on my satchel self. They make me who I am. And because of this, I experience the world and also discrimination in a way that is different from other queer people, including other gay men. Period.
Huh. I guess I don't really think about the word that much. I'm just an intersectional person. I'm Taiwanese American, queer, non-binary, gay. It's important to understand the different ways power and marginalization can exist when you hold different identities.
Cool.
Yeah.
Intersectionality.
And so we have some questions. We'd like you to add your thoughts in the chat, of course. Thinking about intersectionality some more, how does learning about intersectionality affect the way you understand marginalization experienced by men and boys of faith? Let's start with that question. So how does learning about intersectionality affect the way you understand marginalization experienced by men and boys of faith? So someone had said in the chat earlier, not having representation of healthy relationships, not having representation just period. What else? Toxic masculinity, someone said, shows up. How else are we seeing when we really think about intersectionality, people's experiences? I see a comment, hypermasculinity is often seen as okay because it's normal for men. And with hypermasculinity, a lot of times it's assumed or acceptable violence, right? Men in faith communities may not feel safe expressing their vulnerabilities. Faith often shapes morals and values, expectations to act a certain way. Queer men and boys being demonized in their community, absolutely. Compounded harm and violence, absolutely, right? And so again, to understand with these different layers of identity can also come different layers of trauma, can also come different layers of vulnerabilities. Expectations on family dynamics, absolutely as well. So how does faith, gender, and sexuality impact the lived experiences of boys? And we've started naming some of that, but other thoughts on how it really impacts people's lived experiences? And you can think about it in terms of survivorship, if that's helpful too for framing. So it limits their experiences. It limits their voice often. What else? Fear of seeking gender affirming care, absolutely. right? And so it makes it difficult when you're trying to do prevention work and you're like, yeah, come trust us, be engaged with our community, be engaged with our org. And folks are like, based on my lived experiences, I know I can't do that, right? So how are we going to be able to do prevention work with that barrier, right? Like, how do we unpack that? They may feel that they cannot be their true selves, fear of coming out, which we're going to get to in just a little bit. Okay. Often time-delayed development of self-care. We can go to the next slide. Chelsea, I see your comment. I think it limits how someone can identify. For example, same-sex attraction is used instead of queer or other LGBTQ faith labels in LGBTQ labels in faith circles. Absolutely. And what does that do to someone's experience, right? If we're renaming how they're talking about their lives, or we're being limiting for how we're talking about people's experience, right? And so some of the challenges faced by LGBTQ plus individuals of faith include, but this is not an exhaustive list, right? Like these are just some of the things that folks experience. So rejection or condemnation from religious communities and leaders, internalized religious guilt or shame regarding their identity as a queer person, difficulty reconciling one's sexual orientation and gender identity with their religious beliefs, lack of LGBTQ plus affirming religious resources or support groups, fear of losing community or support networks within religious communities if one's LGBTQ identity is disclosed. So basically, if you're outed, you can lose your social supports. And it happens to people within their faith community. It happens with people within their own family dynamics as well. Limited access to LGBTQ faith inclusive religious spaces or ceremonies such as weddings or funerals. If we're still having in the country where bakers are refusing to bake people's wedding cakes or be just involved, period, of course that's going to impact people's lived experience. Of course it's going to impact how someone feels they can trust your system or your org or not. And then religious teachings or doctrines that perpetuate stigma or discrimination against LGBTQ individuals. So if there are people being taught it's a sin, it's a crime, you'll be hated, you won't be loved, you'll have to leave your faith community, then it's going to be that much more difficult to then talk about the violence you're experiencing from your partner, right? Next slide.
So we wanted to make sure today that we have some shared language. So I'm going to quickly go over some definitions that we'll use today for LGBTQ plus terms. These are not the only definitions. These are just abbreviated definitions that we're going to use today to help us have some shared language to have this conversation together. So when we refer to LGBTQ, we're referring to an acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender and queer or questioning individuals. When we refer to sexual orientation, we're talking about who you're attracted to romantically or sexually. When we speak to gender identity, we're talking about how you feel and identify in terms of gender. So my sexual orientation might be bisexual, but my gender identity is non-binary. Gay is a term for a person who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to members of the same gender. It can also refer to men who are attracted to other men. Lesbian is a woman who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to other women. Bisexual is being attracted to more than one gender. And then pansexual is being attracted to people regardless of gender. Transgender is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity or expression is different from the sex that they were assigned at birth, or they don't conform to gender stereotypes. Non-binary is gender identity outside of the male or female binary. And then queer, which is a term you may have heard myself or Ayana use, is an umbrella term for LGBTQ identities, and it can refer to people who don't conform to the mainstream cultural norms around gender or sexuality. This term was previously used as a slur, but it's been reclaimed by many folks in the queer community, especially queer communities of color. Homophobia is a bias against LGBTQ individuals. And then transphobia is a bias against transgender individuals. Heteronormativity is the assumption that heterosexuality is the norm. So when we talked about, when Ayana was saying who is the most normalized identity, whose voices are centered, we all spoke to that this is a straight, white, middle class, able-bodied, cisgendered man. So thinking about how that is connected to heteronormativity. And then heterosexism is discrimination against non-heterosexual individuals. So hopefully that helps us as we continue this conversation to just have some shared language so that we can all understand each other as we continue this critical conversation.
And I always love just a quick review of terms because language is so fluid, and it's come up a lot actually in my advocacy work with other folks of when I say queer, folks are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Especially older generations are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We can't say that. Like, I know it's a bad term, right? That's because historically it was a slur, right? And now it's been reclaimed and it's a whole different feeling in terms of folks using it. So I always think, language, positionality, which we're going to get into in a second, are always great things to really unpack for yourselves in terms of your own advocacy. So we wanted to take just a few moments to really think about more so on identity politics and our positionality, not only in society, but in terms of our advocacy work. Next slide. So this is going to be a very short, quick, personal activity. Do not feel like you have to share. I'll share some of my examples just to help folks frame it out. But this is really the internal work section right now, right? And so when we think about power dynamics, when we think about our positionality in the world and the positionality we have in working with survivors, we still have to really do that own internalized work of what are the different layers of identity that I have, and where in those identities do I have power or not, or even some power, because it's important that when you do have power, you leverage it, and where you don't have power, you gain connections and collaborate, right? And so on any piece of paper, on your phone, a sticky note, whatever you have in front of you, take that out and grab a pen or a pencil. And so in the middle of your page, you're going to write your name, put yourself at the center, whatever you most like to be called. It can be your nickname, it can be your full government legal name, whatever you want, but put that at the center of your page and circle it. So around that, you're going to start listing out the different identities that you have, that you specifically have. What makes you a full, whole person? So I'll give a couple examples for myself. So I identify as Black. I'm Black American. I speak English. I speak a couple languages here and there, but not fluently, right? Like I could throw some stuff in there conversationally. I'm college educated. I was able to go to grad school. I'm a twin. I'm brown skinned. Well, depending on who you ask, I'm either brown or light skinned. I'm plus size or queen size. I own my own car. I have a job, right? Like those are different identities that I hold that help make up my whole personhood. So with that though, come different layers of privilege, come different layers of power. And having privilege, it's not a bad thing. Everyone has privilege to a certain extent or not. It's actually more important to recognize if you have a lot of privilege, how then do you leverage it? So my identity, I mentioned, depending on who you ask, I'm light or brown skin. But regardless of that, I understand I have light skin privilege where someone who is darker than me could be saying the exact same thing. And societally, they are not the norm, so they're more likely to be ignored, right? So understanding that, how can I speak up for people? How can I offer space? How can I step back so that other people have a voice too, right? Like that's part of the framing of why we do this internal work. I mentioned I'm plus size, so I can't just walk into any store and buy clothes. How does that play into other folks' experiences, right? If you're a plus size queer man, can you, like, what are your options? A lot of folks will say, well, we have clothing closets and shelter, right? But are those clothing closets actually accessible to everyone, right? So again, different layers of experience and why we unpack these things. So take just a couple minutes, start writing out those different layers of identity, write where you do have privilege, where you might not, where you have power, where you might not, and how does that impact the way in which you do advocacy? Another example, as folks are writing, I'll just give, when we talk about class, for instance, a lot of folks actually overlook class, which is one of those things like can really be a sneaky way, or it can sometimes sneak up on us in terms of unpacking it. But class matters too, right? If you've never had to think about, can I afford to go to college? You might have some class privilege. It's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean your family didn't work for it. It doesn't mean you didn't work for it. But to understand, a lot of people don't have that access to begin with. Even in high school, have not had access, right? When we talk about queer men's experiences, have not had access to a lot of this same information, then it's important to unpack. So do this unpacking. We're going to keep moving forward. But again, it's really just important to do that own internal self-work and really think about your positionality, especially in relationship to men and boys of faith who are queer, who are LGBTQ+. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Ayana. I think it's so critical as we do this work to think about the identities we hold and how that impacts us as we show up as advocates, as service providers, as preventionists, and making sure that we're really aware of who we are and what we're bringing into the room and our lived experiences, our identities, our privilege, our vulnerabilities as we do this work. So thank you so much for sharing that activity. And it's a Creative Commons activity, so you can utilize that in your workshops. It's free to utilize as long as you cite it. So highly recommend integrating that as a part of your work and for staff trainings. So now we're going to think about navigating LGBTQ+ identities in faith-based communities. So often when we talk about people's experiences within the LGBTQ community, a central piece of people's stories can often be coming out. Coming out is when a person tells someone or others about their sexual orientation or gender identity. And I just want to highlight some different things as we're thinking about coming out stories and coming out narratives. So every coming out experience is unique. Everyone holds different identities, are growing up in different places, have different cultures, religions, personal circumstances, identity. So everyone's coming out experience will be and look different. And all of them are unique. While there might be similarities and overlap, everyone's coming out experience is unique. Also, it's a process. It's not a one-time event. Coming out is not usually just one single moment, but rather an ongoing process where people come out maybe to their family, then they come out to their friends, then they come out in their workplace. So it can involve multiple disclosures over time. And it's not just about the disclosure. Many queer people, I know for myself, I knew that I was bisexual when I was much younger, but it took me so much time because I was grappling with my religion, with my family norms, so many different peoples to actually just accept myself and allow space for that identity exploration, and really feeling a sense of belonging within the LGBTQ community and faith communities. So when we think about coming out, it's not just the disclosure itself, but also that journey of personal discovery and self-acceptance. And something that's very critical to note is that not everyone experiences a coming out moment, right? So some individuals may never come out due to fear of lack of acceptance or fear of safety concerns, right? If they're in an environment where there could be discrimination, harassment, or violence. People may never choose to share their identity, but that still makes their identities valid, regardless of whether they are open about their authentic true self. And the other thing is some people don't have a choice. Sometimes people are outed. And so without their consent, someone is sharing their identity. And so then they are not given that choice or that opportunity to share about their identity for themselves. That is being taken away from them, and they are being involuntarily outed. So as we think about this narrative of coming out, it's important that we look at the nuances and complexity and remember that that's not always the journey for people within their LGBTQ faith identities. So we're going to watch a couple of different videos of different men and boys of faith sharing about their experiences coming out. And this is just a sampling of a couple of different folks and their experiences within their faith. So just remember, this is a sampling, not representational of all faiths and all people's experiences, but I hope it helps you to better understand the barriers and fears that many young men and boys of faith have faced in their coming out journeys. And think a lot about, as you're hearing their stories, the reactions that people in their families have or in their lives have, and how that impacts their experience moving forward.
Looking back, I think the first time I realized I was gay, it was probably around 14. I knew no one that was Hindu and gay. I felt lost and scared and nervous. Certain parts of what I was brought up with was quite conservative. And so when I did come out as gay to my mum when I was about 22, that was definitely difficult. And that was the start of a 6-year journey between her and I towards accepting my sexuality. Hi, Matt. Nice to see you. Matt runs a charity that aims to tackle homophobia caused by religion and culture, and it also helps parents accept their own children who are LGBT as well. And Matt and the charity was important in bringing myself much closer with my mum. Now I'm at a place where my whole family are incredibly supportive, and I owe my whole world to Matt and the charity.
You know, I go into schools and I do school talks. You know, we go into assemblies sometimes. We talk about faith, culture, tradition, what it means to be LGBTQ+. And now we've received an increased demand in schools requesting talks from us. So how would you feel about sharing your story? Going into a school with me, possibly your own school?
The thought of that absolutely terrifies me.
If I'm really honest with you, it terrifies me every time I go into a school. But by you sharing your story, you know, hopefully that will resonate with some of the students that are there who can identify with you.
When I was at school, you know, I embraced my religion. I led the Hindu assembly here. I prayed often, but the one thing I did was completely suppress my sexuality because I was terrified of it. And to be able to come here and be a niche that celebrates all of his identity, celebrates being Hindu, celebrates being gay, is just the most surreal thing. I knew from an early age that I was different, and that I didn't necessarily fit the stereotype of a young teenage boy. And quite possibly that I was gay, fearing that faith would not accept who I was inside. I just feel over the moon, and it feels like full circle. I feel like I've had closure. I feel like I've healed. It's just amazing to see that times were so different from when I was a student, and I just have so much more faith that people now at school are hopefully less likely to kind of go through what I went through as a teenager. But why am I here telling you all of this? Well, I remember sitting in your position, going through school, and perhaps feeling different. And I wish someone told me the following: Anish, you are loved, be as you are, and you will never be alone. And today, I want to say to all of you that you are loved, be as you are, and you will never be alone. Thank you for listening.
So this is a short clip from a documentary that I had the opportunity to work on while I was at JWI called As a Jewish Man, that looks at the intersection of masculinity and Judaism.
When I came out to my parents, I was absolutely terrified. I was at the dormitory in Memphis, came home for Shabbos because I was like, I need to tell you guys something. And my mom's like, oh, what is it? I was like, I'll tell you when I get home. Thinking, terrified, well, at least if they kick me out, I have a bus on Sunday and I'm gonna go back and I can just stay in Memphis for the rest of the year. Which did not happen. When I came out to my parents, my father immediately jumped up and pulled me into a hug and said, Gidon, I'm so proud of you for being so honest. Where I am now is like a safe, secure, happy Jewish man, I think is a direct testament to his support. But I think for him, he stays very true to his values while making sure that he doesn't lose sight of the human who's being affected by them. And I think when I think about my own life and if I have kids and what I'd want to pass on to them, I think it's that same, commitments that he has shown to me.
When I was thinking about a lot of
when I came out to my parents,
And this will be our last video clip.
Community can be found in many places, but in the South, church is everything. In fact, the South is by far the most religious region in the country. A recent study indicates that an overwhelming 90% of Southerners believe in God, and over 80% say that religion is an important part of their daily lives. But many churches still reject LGBTQ people, who often have to decide between hiding who they are or being cut off from the biggest source of community they've ever known. But that's not the case in every church. I recently traveled to one of the most devout places in the country, Mississippi. And right there in the capital of Jackson, I found a church with an openly gay pastor whose mission it is to welcome anyone and everyone into their community of faith.
Hi, you must be Pastor Lowry. Rob Lowry. Good to have you with us.
Alon Burnside.
Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Welcome, Father.
Thank you for having me in your church today. This is a really beautiful space. How long have you been a minister in the church?
I'm going into my 20th year of ministry.
What's your journey been like as an openly gay minister? Have you always been out in the church?
I've not. I came out almost 11 years ago, and that was the end of a really long personal journey. When I went to seminary, the church at the time had a ban on gay clergy. You could not be ordained if you were openly gay in the Presbyterian church at that point. I got ordained, I got married, I got divorced.
You got married to a woman?
I got married to a wonderful woman, but our marriage didn't last. Not being out was waking up every morning and living my day dishonestly.
See, what the community learned when Jesus healed that man in the cemetery, your world has to change with the gospel.
One day, in the middle of the day, it just dawned on me that the only way for me to truly be the person I feel called to be in the church was to be the person I truly feel called to be entirely. Being openly gay and being out in the world, that's the only way for me to wake up in the morning and start telling the truth every day.
Jesus reaches into the world and brings compassion and love and healing and wholeness where there was none.
So when you decided to come out, what kind of responses did you get from the church?
It was sort of a 99-to-1 ratio of people who were tremendously welcoming and embracing. Friends, my family, my colleagues, all, without exception, were wonderfully welcoming to me.
That's incredible. You realize that's like not the experience of most people.
I realize exactly how lucky I am. I really do.
Who are you? I grew up going to a private Christian school. I was in church every day. Mm-hmm. It was my life.
Yeah.
I worked at a church that was non-denominational but had Southern Baptist roots. Mm-hmm. I led a team of about 50 volunteers. I Two, never thought that being out was an option. I sort of suppressed these thoughts, these feelings for so long, just thinking that I'd be able to pray it away.
Yeah.
I told my pastor that I was attracted to men, and I lost my job. And it took me years to be able to walk back into a church. What that experience did for me was made me question everything that I thought I knew to be true about God, about the church, about myself. And so I had to figure out a new way to engage with God. And a part of that was leaving the church. Now that life seems so far away.
Sure.
And figuring out how to build that community has been a really difficult journey to figure out how to get.
Community can be found in many places.
Great. So thank you for watching those videos with us. I think it's so critical as we do this work to center the voices and experiences of LGBTQ men and boys of faith. So I'd love if you could share in the chat, what are some insights you gained from watching these videos, hearing the fears that LGBTQ men and boys of faith had about coming out? What were they afraid of in terms of how their loved ones or their faith communities would react? They were afraid of losing support systems, afraid of losing long-lasting relationships, that they could change that it could change how people see them as a person. Absolutely. Job security. Yes. In that last video, we saw someone literally lost their job because of being gay. There is a harm in being rejected from a space that ought to foster community. Absolutely. They were afraid of losing housing. Gadone shared in his video that he was afraid his parents would kick him out. Being afraid of being excommunicated from their families and community of faith. In that last video, we heard that you weren't allowed to be a minister if you were gay, right? So not having that access to family or faith community. Fear of creating welcoming environments so people know that they are safe. Debate between hiding identity or losing a central part of their life. Absolutely. We saw throughout each of those videos, people really debating, like, can I suppress this because I care so deeply about my faith community, and not feeling like those things could coexist. There are layers of fear that impact their ability to be themselves, that impact which can last a lifetime. Absolutely. As we saw in most of those videos, a lot of them were contemplating this decision for a while because of the fear of that impact. So moving to the next question, what did you learn about the impact of how people reacted to LGBTQ men of faith coming out? And I want you to think about specifically, how can your organization or program create a supportive and affirming environment for LGBTQ men of faith who are considering coming out? What was the impact of Gadone's father honoring his humanity? What was the impact of the minister having 99% of people being supportive and welcoming of that identity? Being celebrated can literally save someone's life for their own mental health, or in the case that they're in a DV relationship. Absolutely. Being affirming, being supportive in a world that is extremely homophobic and transphobic is life-saving. Embracing authenticity Educating staff is a start. Absolutely. We'll talk a little bit more about different things that you can do, but educating staff is critical. Creating a safe space for them to be who they are. Whether that's having, a rainbow flag up in your office, or inviting in different queer speakers or queer people, or even just including pronouns in your emails. These are all little ways to say to someone, this is a safe space, we see you, and we love you exactly for who you are. Having discussions about healthy masculinity and gender roles, gender expectations, and breaking stigma. Absolutely. We are all conditioned and existing in a world with particular norms. And so what can we do to shift those norms and change those norms? This is a very short clip from a pastor of an LGBTQ affirming congregation, just talking a little bit about what he sees more broadly within the community.
Everyone is welcome through
Absolutely.
those doors. LGBTQ plus community as well. It's not that way with other churches. Why?
Unfortunately, many people have used Christianity as, in many ways, as a cover, but also maybe even as a conduit for their hate.
So it's so critical that we do a little bit to unpack faith and homophobia as we continue this conversation. So how can religion be used as a cover or a conduit of hate of LGBTQ people, like Pastor Mike mentioned in that video? Misunderstanding and misquoting of certain scriptures, absolutely. I know I've seen within my own experience the way that religion can be used to try to justify harmful beliefs. And so people using scriptures, holy texts, rituals, songs, different things to try to justify their own hateful beliefs. What are other ways it can be used as a cover or conduit of hate? As an excuse or reason to avoid growth or change. Absolutely. I think that it can be scary to exist in a different world, especially if you're new to this information, you're not comfortable with this, maybe this is different than what you experience in your generation. And so I think that sometimes people will avoid learning the terminology, understanding these concepts, understanding these terms, because they don't want to have to grow, to have to change. Reading scriptures from a lens of love and justice can be used as an excuse to not provide resources. Absolutely. Homophobia can be used to justify not providing support or resources to folks. So on the converse, I want to hear, how can religion also be a conduit of love, acceptance, and inclusivity? It's exactly what the scripture teaches. It can promote community. Absolutely. In Judaism, we believe in a concept called B'Tselem Elohim, which means in the image of God. So in following my Jewish religion, I see divinity in everyone. I see holiness in everyone. And that means I see holiness in all of the identities they hold. And so I think that religion can be a huge way for us to understand each other's humanity, and to show love and care and acceptance to all of the identities we hold if we see each other as an image of God. I've had a lot of survivors be provided housing from their faith community when escaping violence. Absolutely. Faith communities can be a huge resource for support when people are navigating challenging circumstances or violence. It can offer a sense of community, access to resources. Definitely, religion and faith can be such a huge resource and help people access the skills, the tools, the information, and different things that they need. And it can be a way to cope, absolutely. I know in working with survivors, a lot of people found faith that really helped them get through some of these challenging and difficult moments as they were trying to escape violence. And so faith can be a very important part of people's healing process. It's an emphasis on no one being better than the next person. All persons are deserving of love. Absolutely. So many religions highlight this, that no one is better than anyone, and that we all deserve love and care. By vocally expressing your stand and welcoming as a welcoming church for all. Absolutely. A lot of religious institutions have come out and said that anyone is welcome here. And that's something so beautiful and such an important statement to make to honor inclusivity. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Ayana to talk about power dynamics.
Thank you. And we've already started unpacking a lot of this, so let's get into it a bit more. Next slide. So I love Patricia Hill Collins. She's one of my favorite people. Get to know her work. She's great in terms of framing and talking about power dynamics societally and within relationships. But Patricia Hill Collins says oppressed groups are frequently placed in the situation of being listened to only if we frame our ideas in the language that is familiar to and comfortable for a dominant group. This requirement often changes the meaning of our ideas and works to elevate the ideas of dominant groups. And so again, when we're thinking about intersectionality, when we're thinking about personhood, when we're thinking about survivorship, vulnerability, trauma, all of those things, we have to really understand we can't force someone to explain their life in a way that's comfortable for us. Or we can't force someone to be and live a life that is not authentic to themselves. And when we require that, we're taking away safety, we're taking away autonomy, we're taking away people's voices, and we're really just working to recenter ourselves as folks that have power or have privilege. And so by all means, to really do this self-investigative work, do these deep dives, really have these conversations with men and boys of faith of what has your experience been? In what ways have you not felt supported? What could I do more of to make you feel supported? Next slide. And so, again, just very quickly, because we've been breaking it down already, thinking about power and what it is, it's the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behaviors of others or courses of events. And so when we think about faith communities, if we have a faith leader that has all the power in that faith institution, right? And they're saying, you're not welcome in this space, then they have the ability to direct and influence the rest of the folks in that community. Similarly with privilege, privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted to or available to a particular person or group, and privilege can be both earned and unearned. So when we think about white privilege, for instance, if you are a person of color and you're queer and of faith, how is your experience going to be different from someone who is white and has similar identities? Because it still will be different. And so when we're thinking about advocacy, it's really important to talk about privilege, because even if I'm Black and the survivor is Black, if it's a man and identify as a woman, automatically we have different layers of experience and insight. And so I need to be able to reconcile that and also be able to shift my lens or broaden my lens even, so that I'm actually getting them what they need and not what I would think of. Because what I would think of and what I need is going to be different. And so the big reminder about when talking about power and privilege is that although we go into gender-based violence work with best intentions, we still operate from a place of privilege and power when working with survivors. We cannot exert power and expect to empower. Next slide. And so again, we've talked about this with that wheel and with the unpacking, but again, different layers of power will still exist. So we have structural power dynamics. Society structural power favors some groups over others, often perpetuating homophobia, for instance. Heterosexual individuals hold societal power, while LGBTQ plus individuals will face discrimination based on that. We have cultural and religious norms and values showing up. Many cultures and faiths uphold heteronormative beliefs, considering heterosexuality the norm and homosexuality abnormal or a sin. Those who conform to the norms hold to social power and reinforce homophobia often. And so again, it's important to be able to name homophobia when it's present, name those other isms when it's present, and really think about how do I recenter someone's experience when they've been so marginalized. And then intersectionality, which we've gone over, but thinking about when it comes to LGBTQ folks, how are they marginalized based on their racial or ethnic identities as well, and how are there compounding discriminations that they're experiencing? Next slide. With systemic oppression, it's really, again, important to think about, because a lot of folks will say, well, I'm working with a domestic violence survivor, I really need to focus in on that. That's the most important thing. But for a lot of survivors, they're like, I would be okay if I had stable housing. I would be okay and I can move past this relationship if I know I'm going to have money to eat food every day. I would be okay if I could leave the apartment and go back to my family's house. But because of these different layers, or because, I have a criminal record and I face discrimination in that system, it's just more difficult for me to navigate through the world. And so when we think about also the impact on LGBTQ plus communities, really focusing in on homophobia, for instance, thinking about how it extends through all these different layers of personal experiences, of access, of human rights, of employment benefits, of safety, right? People are still losing their jobs because they're being outed. People are, there are people saying we need databases to track folks and report folks, and we need, we can't have this happening in the church, we can't have this happening in the mosque. But to really think about what do our communities need and what do the survivors in our communities need. And if they're saying yes, domestic violence of course is part of what's happening to me, but I need these other layers of my experience also tended to. And it usually comes from what is their relationship with their faith community and how has it been impacted. Next slide. And so some extra barriers that LGBTQ folks face, we've talked about it, but breaking it down a little bit more, when it comes to institutional bias and legal challenges, for instance, we often see a lack of representation of LGBTQ plus men and boys of faith, lack of resources that are culturally relevant, fear of people correlating abuse with LGBTQ identities, barriers to legal resources as legal systems may not adequately protect LGBTQ plus survivors, employment and housing discrimination, implicit bias within service provision, challenges in accessing shelters or support services as well due to their LGBTQ identity, especially for trans people. And a lot of people will say, well, yeah, you can come here as a shelter, it's for survivors. And still, it's very common that trans people are referred to homeless shelter instead of domestic violence shelter, for instance. Next slide. And so again, just more breaking this down. And when it comes to cultural and social challenges we see, cultural stigma and violence are very common. The pressure of representing the entire LGBTQ faith community that's often placed on people of like, you have to show up as a good person in the community, right? Lack of family support, minimizing and acceptance of violence by the community, so overlooking it or just seeing it, that's just what happens with folks like that. Stereotyping as well, and I know those videos talked a lot about how stereotypes showed up for folks, especially when they were coming out. And it comes to healthcare and financial barriers. So thinking about what do those increased barriers look like? If we know that societally someone who is queer does not have the same job protections, how does that impact them further when they're in a domestic violence relationship? Reliance on their partner's health care or their partner's health insurance for gender affirming care or just for care in general, right? And then police or service providers believing that the abuse is mutual, which a lot of folks, again, because of that implicit bias that's still very present, will arrive on a scene and assume that, oh, they were fighting each other, or that's what gay people do, right? And so to really make sure we're understanding these different layers, we have to. Next slide.
So we wanted to share that there is a power and control wheel that specifically speaks to the experiences of LGBTQ plus relationships. And I just want to note that you'll see on that outer ring, heterosexism, transphobia, biphobia, and homophobia. And so it's so critical that as we think about the different forms of abuse that people are experiencing in their relationships, we're also thinking about the power structures that Ayana has, mentioned and talked about in our analysis in terms of thinking about their lived experiences and the violence that they may face, violence and discrimination they may face. So I want to highlight one form of abuse that is very specific to the LGBTQ community is identity abuse, which is the use of someone's identity to demean, manipulate, or control one's partner. And some of examples of how that could look is questioning if your partner is a real lesbian or a real man, or using negative stereotypes. For example, because bisexual or pansexual people might be attracted to people of multiple genders, accusing that person of cheating just because they might be attracted to multiple people of different identities. Making your partner feel bad about their gender expression, ridiculing someone's identity, normalizing violence in LGBTQ relationships, as Ayana mentioned, for example, saying all guys fight, using your partner's identity in order to manipulate them into thinking that no one else would love them. So because you're a gay, trans man, no one else will love you the way I love you, right? That's very common to see within dating or domestic violence within LGBTQ relationships. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of unique dynamics that we see present with it for dating abuse within LGBTQ relationships. So threats of outing, right? A perpetrator may threaten to reveal someone's identity without their consent. And that's a way for them to access power and control. So if someone threatens to leave the relationship, they might say that they would out them. Or if someone, threatens to, if someone says that they want something to change, that person might, threaten to out them to their work. So outing can be a huge way that abusers can hold control in the relationship and control the survivor. Another unique dynamic is identity denial. So perpetrators may undermine the survivor's LGBTQ identity, dismissing their experiences or sense of self. We also will see misgendering or dead naming. So a perpetrator may intentionally use the incorrect pronouns or maybe use the name that they were assigned at birth that that person doesn't connect with or align with as they've come into their own identity. And those are ways of disregarding that person's identity and causing harm. We'll also see control of LGBTQ spaces. Queer communities can often be very tight-knit. So perpetrators might restrict someone's access to those community spaces or tell them that they can't have friendships that are same gender, accusing that person of cheating or flirting to try to isolate that person from their support network. And they also might exploit their internalized stigma. So if someone has internalized transphobia or homophobia, they may, a perpetrator may utilize that to hold control within their relationship. A couple more is weaponizing HIV status or PrEP use. So a perpetrator using a victim status as a tool of coercion and manipulation. We talked a lot about cultural or religious rejection, limiting access to gender-affirming care. So a partner may try to control what procedures their partner can't have, shouldn't have. And also using LGBTQ relationship experience to justify abuse. So if someone is newer to their identity, newer to being in a LGBTQ relationship, a perpetrator might use a survivor's newness to claim that they have more expertise or understanding in what a LGBTQ relationship should look like. And that's used to manipulate and control their partner. And also limited access to support, right? Many survivors struggle to access LGBTQ affirming resources. Ayana mentioned how many shelters for a long time did not allow trans women or trans people. And so that can further isolate them and block them from accessing supportive services. So now we're going to move into best practices for prevention and LGBTQ survivor support. And we're running a little low on time, so I'm going to move through this quickly, but again, we're going to share the slides so you can come back and revisit this. So in terms of creating campaigns, you want to make it customizable so that people can share about their unique identities and faiths. So to the side, we have a collection of submissions from JWI's Interfaith Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, DVAM 2019 campaign called My Faith Teaches Me to Advocate For. So this offered people the opportunity to share about their Muslim faith, their Jewish faith, their Christian faith, and talk about the values and things that their faith has taught them. So it allowed them to customize it and share about their unique identities and experiences. Have religious leaders and community leaders participate. This will help create buy-in, and it also sets an example. If the person that people look up to, they see as a messenger in the community, is supporting violence prevention work, that sends a message to the whole congregation, to the whole community. And also try to keep messaging simple and accessible so it's easy for people to participate. Ask for ideas and input from LGBTQ men and boys of faith. Folks know their community best, so give them that opportunity to share and participate and be a part of the planning process. We've talked a lot about in this workshop the lack of positive representation. And so I would really encourage you, as we're doing this work, when we're creating campaigns, when we're creating media, can we help people visualize the world we're trying to create? So in our campaigns, can we spotlight what allyship is? Can we spotlight what a healthy LGBTQ relationship within a faith community could look like, so we all can better vision that versus continuing to harp on the negatives? I highly encourage you to create your own images or videos. Often we find that stock content might not reflect the identities of our community. And so I highly encourage you to make that a part of your budget, to create that media so that when people see the images, they see the content, they feel it really reflects them and their experiences and community. And use campaigns to build bridges, cultivate connections, and really engage new leaders to be a part of this work and to contribute to their community. In terms of curriculum and prevention programming efforts, before you submit a proposal, speak to LGBTQ men and boys of faith. So that way you have an understanding of what are the most pressing issues in that community and what resources are needed. Time and time again, I will see organizations write a proposal thinking and assuming what resources or tools people need. Talk to the community first so that what you create will be successful and well received. Hire and collaborate with LGBTQ people of faith and LGBTQ survivors to develop resources for their community. Hiring people who have that understanding, have that lived experience, helps to create impactful, authentic, and culturally competent programs. And if you don't know someone, ask around. I bet this incredible community within the OVW program and within the consortium can help connect you with people who have that lived experience and expertise so that we can create more authentic and culturally competent programs. And also, don't be afraid to create programs that might seem kind of niche, because there is a need. So while I was at JWI, I had the opportunity to co-create with a Jewish survivor Jordan Dashow, a program that was specifically about addressing sexual violence in the LGBTQ Jewish student community. And it was received so well because people said, we've never had an opportunity to have this specific conversation. So don't be afraid to create a program for a specific religion and addressing a specific form of violence. Again, hire LGBTQ people of faith and LGBTQ survivors of faith, survivors to facilitate your programs. I am so grateful that JWI offered me this opportunity and that I could help offer this programming as a person of faith who is LGBTQ. It's so meaningful, and it also feels like a great way to give back to my community. Lift up the values and beliefs of the community that align with inclusion, respect, and violence prevention. So many people gain their values from their religion, so let's utilize those values to further this work. Include faith-specific texts, quotes, songs, language, prayers, rituals, and media. It is beautiful to use the dimensions and different aspects of our faith and all of these incredible resources to enrich the violence prevention work we do. And I would also say try to customize the programming and images to align with the religious norms of your audience. So I had the opportunity to provide a consent education workshop to a very religious Jewish college. And it was really important to me that when I talked about consent with them, I wasn't talking about hookup culture because that doesn't reflect the norms of the community. And also it was important that I had images that showed people wearing modest clothes to reflect the norms of the community. So make sure you're customizing to align so that the examples and the images land with your audience. Create programs that can be incorporated into religious holidays or an event. This is such an easy way to integrate prevention programming into the work that we're already doing in communities. Especially within religion, there are so many rich holidays and beautiful traditions, and that's a way that we can integrate prevention programming into these spaces and make it so much easier for us to highlight our faith and do the work to cultivate a culture of respect. Make sure your events are open to LGBTQ plus and allies so that attendance does not out LGBTQ individuals. Include media that centers the stories and experiences of LGBTQ men of faith, and include pronouns in your emails. Include pronouns when you do introductions, and include pronouns on intake forms. That is a simple way to say to someone, I see you, I affirm you, and I'm here for you. And that way it doesn't put the onus on queer people to have to disclose that information. You're creating an environment that is normalizing sharing that information. So I turn it back to Ayana.
Yeah, and so we've talked through this, but again, for emphasis, right, it's really important to center the lived experiences of the people that you're serving. You cannot accurately do this work without centering the experiences and voices of LGBTQ plus survivors, both in community and within faith institutions. We really want to make sure that we're not devaluing anyone, that we're not taking anyone's voice from them, that we're not causing another layer of harm or trauma, or even just reasserting power dynamics that already exist and they've already experienced. We have to ask ourselves, who benefits when certain voices are silenced? Is that what we want to do in our work? And can we really serve a community without understanding the realities of that community? Next slide. So again, just some best practices moving forward and just generally in your work. Believe and validate their experiences. A lot of folks, similar to just survivors in general, are constantly told nobody's going to believe you, nobody cares, nobody's going to listen to you, right? And so we want to undo that harm that's been done. Be mindful of language. Pay attention to the language that you are using. Make sure you ask about pronouns. Don't assume gender. Don't assume sexual identity or even faith identity. Act with compassion. Make sure you're showing empathy. Tone matters here too. Make sure to prioritize consent. And what I'm talking about is informed consent. And so if you need to disclose something, make sure you talk about that up front before someone tells you a whole bunch of intimate details that they don't want shared. Community connections are especially important, so make sure you're building bridges with the community and with trusted individuals within that community. Safety planning as well. Really lean into the intersectional framework when you're doing safety planning, because it's not so easy just to say, well, just call the police, right? Or just go to the shelter, or just go to your family member's house, knowing all of these different layers we've already talked about. Next slide. Again, really tune into those unique barriers to reporting. So does it feel safe? Does it feel brave? Is it going to cause further problems in their social networks or in their communities? Educate yourselves, learning about identities, learning about terms, delving into new language and how it's shaped and how it's shifted. All of those things are important to do. Make sure you're asking questions so that we're moving past assumptions and really getting into some meaningful conversation. Make sure we're providing affirming supportive services. Again, we've talked so much about how people aren't affirmed within their communities. And as we're servicing and providing and supporting, we really, again, want to make sure we're undoing some of those societal harms in our work. Advocate for inclusion, and then make sure you're taking care of yourself as well. Like, this work is hard. It's a lot of new information sometimes. It's a whole new focus sometimes. And so make sure you're doing that self-care and doing that self-work. Next slide.
I know we are over time, so if folks need to hop off, we totally understand. We're going to continue to move through this content, and it will be recorded, so everyone will have access to it. So here are some ways to be an ally to LGBTQ men and boys of faith. So first, educate yourself, as Ayana was talking about. Take the time to really learn about the experiences, struggles, and challenges faced by LGBTQ individuals within a religious context. Listen and amplify their voices. We all have a platform. We all within our organizations have access to resources and community. So what can we do to utilize that to give men and boys of faith an opportunity to share their stories, share their experiences, respect religious beliefs, understand that LGBTQ people of faith have a variety of levels of religious observance and different beliefs and traditions. And so it's important that we don't see them as a monolith, and we respect their own faith traditions and their own spiritual journey, whatever that looks like. Challenge discrimination and prejudice. Speak up against homophobia, transphobia, and discrimination within religious spaces and within your organizations. I guarantee you, queer people are watching. And so when they hear and see people speaking up, that tells them that that person is a safe person to connect with, and it helps them feel supported and affirmed. And also really try to challenge harmful stereotypes and misconceptions about LGBTQ individuals. I would definitely say, if you're creating media, think about if the representation that you are putting out is furthering some of these harmful tropes that we often see. So be very mindful of the stereotypes and misconceptions that exist. Support LGBTQ rights. Right now, there are many bills targeting young trans folks, and it is so critical that we advocate for LGBTQ rights within religious communities and society at large, because there's so much at stake. Just recently, a young non-binary teen was literally killed in a bathroom at their school because of laws that made it that they had to use a bathroom aligned with their sex at birth. So it is so critical. Lives are on the line for us to advocate for LGBTQ rights and support especially LGBTQ youth. Use inclusive language. So when you open a training, instead of saying, "Hello, ladies and gentlemen," which would exclude non-binary people, you could say, "Hello, everyone," or "Hello, folks." And that's an easy way to make everyone in the room feel included. I have been to so many trainings where people only refer to survivors as she, and that excludes non-binary people, that excludes men. So be aware of the language you're using and how that might impact and reflect people then their own experiences of survivorship and their own identities. So I'm not going to go too in depth on this, but we have put together a list of resources for serving and supporting LGBTQ plus survivors. Many of these organizations offer training and technical technical assistance, I especially want to highlight the National LGBTQ Institute on Intimate Partner Violence. They offer amazing trainings and provide culturally relevant survivor-centered intervention and prevention services. So definitely think about requesting a training from them for your organization. I also want to highlight Forge, For Ourselves, Reworking Gender Expression. They work to reduce the impact of trauma on trans and non-binary survivors and communities by empowering service providers. They have an amazing wealth of resources on their website. You can find lots of webinar recordings and lots of great resources. So I highly, highly recommend Forge. Northwest Network, they have been doing this work for so long and serving thousands of queer and trans survivors, specifically in the Seattle area. They also offer training and technical assistance. New York City Anti-Violence Project, the nation's largest organization supporting survivors of violence who are LGBTQ. They also offer wonderful resources if you're in the New York area and have a hotline. The LGBTQ National Hotline, if you're thinking about where are queer affirming services, this is a hotline that provides peer support. So it's queer people supporting queer people. And they also have online chat rooms. And then VAWA.net has collections around different topics. They have a whole collection on LGBTQ survivor resources. So I highly recommend looking through that collection to see what has already been created and what's available for folks working in this space. In terms of faith-focused resources, HRC has a great website that has lots of information for LGBTQ people, their families, and allies, and thinking about that intersection of faith and LGBTQ issues. PFLAG has put together a wonderful publication called Faith in Our Families that is, if you're working with parents, this is a great resource for supporting a loved one who is LGBTQ and kind of answering some of these questions, grappling around faith and LGBTQ identity. The Family Acceptance Project has a resource list of affirming congregations across the US and also provides access to fellowship, religious services, and educational resources. If you're looking to connect with trans people of faith, Trans Faith is a national nonprofit that's led by transgender people working to support trans folks in the spiritual and cultural space. Strong Family Alliance also has a list of faith-based organizations supporting different LGBTQ folks. And then Queer Theology Podcast, if you're someone who really enjoys podcasts, this is a great place to learn about the experiences of LGBTQ people of faith and spiritual seekers.
And so we're just closing out. We didn't see any Q&A come through. So if people do have specific questions, definitely feel free to reach out to us or come to our consortium office hours. That'd be a great opportunity. On this next slide, we just have the closing question. And this is really a question for you all to take back and have more conversation. Again, continue that conversation piece. How will you apply what you learned to your work? Very simply, right? Like we've taught all this conversation about intersectionality, about layered identity, layered violence, trauma, being an affirming space, power dynamics, best practices. What are you going to do with it now? How are you going to, even if it's one piece in your work, how are you going to shift it to make it more inclusive for LGBTQ men and boys of faith? What can we do better? How can we do our work better? How can we be more creative, right? And so really take that back to your teams, have these fuller conversations, reach out to us with questions. Yes, we will absolutely share the video links. And thank you so much for staying with us and being engaged in this conversation. It was really important for both of us to have this conversation. So we appreciate you all being so invested in this work and being so invested in making this work more inclusive. Thank you all.
We will stay on. So if you have any questions for us, we're happy to stay on and share. I also put my email in the chat. And so if there's anyone who wants to reach out to either of us individually to ask more, we're happy to be a resource. Thank you so much again for participating and joining us. And I really want to thank JWI for all the amazing work that they're doing as a part of this consortium and offering us this opportunity to share about this critical topic. And thank you for OVW for creating the space for this type of training work.